Hello everyone, my name is Zenitsu, and I'm back with another Digimon spoilers video. So, over the past couple of days, we definitely got a lot of new and exciting cards, so let's just start talking about them. First up, we have Darkdramon. So, Darkdramon is a black level 6 Digimon. Stats aren't anything too spectacular, but he does have two really interesting abilities. So his first ability is this haste ability, or swift attacking ability, where this Digimon can attack during the turn it comes into play. So this is probably referring to the fact that you have to play it from its hand, and that means that you're going to have to use its initial cost, but this is a Mega, and its initial cost is really, really large. Without reading his other ability, that doesn't exactly make a whole lot of sense on why you would do this, but what is interesting to note is the fact that Digimon is going to start playing around with this type of a mechanic, and that's just really something interesting to look to see how they're doing it and how they're implementing it, because haste in this type of a game could be very, very dangerous, but done smartly and done interestingly, like with Darkdramon, it could be a very, interesting mechanic. So, what really makes Darkdramon be able to use the fact that he does have this haste ability is his when played ability. So, his when played ability is you get to basically return any number up to 5 D-Brigade Digimon from your trash to the top of your deck, and then you gain 2 memory for each one you returned. So ideally, you would return 5 D-Brigade Digimon, and then you'll gain 10 memory. So he really is basically trying to be a 3-cost Mega with haste, and that's just something really, really powerful to think about. But this is more of a late game type of play, where you have to really have your trash set up to support this type of ability. And right now, we don't really have a whole lot of other D-Brigade Digimon to really go off of to really start to try to use this ability, but it's definitely a really powerful ability to play with and think about nonetheless. So I'm just super excited to see what other D-Brigade they're going to possibly bring to the game so that you could actually try to use this ability more effectively, and I'm really excited to see what other Digimon could get this haste mechanic later on, but right now what we have with Darkdramon is definitely really, really interesting and could be very, very powerful. Next up, we have a couple of new tamers to look at. So starting with Damien over here. He is a 4-cost red tamer, and he has your basic memory fixing ability, where if your memory is 2 or less, it becomes 3. So nothing too special there. But what is interesting is he has a passive ability where during your turn, when your Digimon with Greymon in its name attacks, you could rest this tamer and gain +1 memory. This is a pretty good ability to have because not only does he fix your memory, which is a pretty alright ability on its own, but the fact that when you start attacking with your Greymons, then you get additional memory for just attacking. On top of which, this isn't color locked to just red Greymons, so you could use this card in other Greymon decks to just potentially gain more memory, and I think that's just a really, really interesting thing to play around with. Obviously, we already know that Red Shine Greymon is going to be a card, and he just has natural synergy with that, where Red Shine Greymon's going to attack, then you can use Marcus to rest himself down, gain a memory, and then the Red Shine Greymon will get security attack +1 from Damien being rested. So he just has just some very good synergies with Greymons as a whole, and more in particular combos well with Shine Greymon. So I definitely think this is going to be a pretty good and interesting tamer to play around with. Next up, we have Thomas. So Thomas is a pretty interesting tamer in his own right. So his initial ability is he has a when played ability. You get to draw a card, which is pretty alright. So a lot of people are already playing Booster Set 1 Gabumon, which is just a 3-cost Digimon to just draw you a card when you play it. So he kind of has a good comparison there. So he's not necessarily completely bad in that aspect, but he does have a pretty interesting main ability where when your opponent has 8 or more cards in your hand, you could rest this tamer and choose one of your Digimon with Gao in its name, and you basically get to activate it, or unsuspend it, or unrest it, whatever terminology you prefer. But regardless, he's just doing kind of something similar to what a lot of other blue stuff is doing, where it's just kind of just trying to set up multi-attacks. I'm not super thrilled with the condition where your opponent has to have 8 or more cards in, and then you also have to have a Gao in its name. And I don't think the Gao line is going to make the opponent draw cards, because that just sounds like a really bad idea to do. So I don't exactly know why they have that kind of ability, but he definitely does kind of soft confirm the fact that the Gao line is going to be showing up in this set. And it's definitely going to be a really interesting one, because it looks like it's going to be another line that is going to be focused on multi-attacking. So I'm just curious to see how it's going to achieve this multi-attacking synergy that it's trying to set up. But again, at worst, Thomas is just a 3-cost tamer that you get to draw a card off of, and then we already know that we have these hybrid Digimon where you could Digivolve them off of tamers. So like I said, at worst, he is just a 3-cost draw 1 card, and then you could use him to set up your hybrids. So he definitely has a lot of interesting synergies, and I definitely like the soft confirmation of the Gao line coming, because otherwise, why would they print him without the Gao line? So I'm curious to see where this type of card goes. Next, we have Yoshino. So Yoshino is pretty interesting because she has a rather unique when played ability where we get to return a Digitama from our trash to the bottom of our Digitama deck. So we have a lot of cards that kind of just already start putting cards from our trash to the top or bottom of the deck, depending on what card you're looking at. So the fact that we finally have a card that does that for the Digitamas is definitely something really interesting to note. And then on top of which, she also has another ability where during your turn, when you evolve your Digimon into a Digimon from your hand that has the digi-burst ability, you could rest this tamer and reduce the evo cost by 1. So just one big thing to note is this ability does not work in the raising area. So you will not be able to get this ability if your Digimon you're Digivolving into is in the raising area. But if it's outside the raising area, then you do get this ability. And this is just pretty nice because it's doing something that green generally likes to do, which is cost reduction or like ramping in a way, where you just try to play your bigger cards a lot faster and a lot more efficient than the opponent. So I definitely think this card is pretty interesting. A lot of people are already saying this has some really good synergy with Mimi, because essentially with Mimi out, you could speed up your rate of raising Digimon from the raising area. So you'll be going through your Digitama a lot faster, so a card like Yoshino becomes a lot better because you'll be using your Digitama more than the opponent, so having a good way to refresh that is going to be something a lot of decks want. And then the Digi-burst mechanic is also really good because you could start discarding those Digitamas when you use the Digi-burst ability, and this is just another way of getting those Digitamas back. So overall, I just think this is going to be a really interesting card that I think a lot of green players are going to be looking at. Next up, we have another version of Tai Chi. So this is a yellow Tai Chi, and this card is looking to be really, really good and really, really interesting. So the big thing that this card does is it does 2 things. So when your security is 3 or less, then all of your Digimon get plus 1000 DP. So for yellow, this is really, really important because for the most part, yellow's Digimon haven't had the highest number of DP. So they've kind of just been lacking in the DP department, and having a card like this to help them catch up in the DP and be able to clear more security checks or just have the ability to deal with the opponent's Digimon more efficiently is always a good thing. And then on top of which, he even has another passive ability where when your opponent's Digimon's DP is reduced to 0 and is deleted, then you get to rest this tamer and gain +1 memory. So these are 2 things that yellow is doing quite a lot of and yellow really, really wants to do. So the fact that this is a card that is rewarding you for those lines of play is definitely a very, very powerful card to think about when putting together your yellow deck. Obviously, the big synergy is supposed to go off of the new WarGrowlmon, but this card could work in Shine Greymon. This card could work in Cherubimon. This card is just a overall really powerful and really good yellow tamer card. Next up, we have a new version of Izzy. So Izzy is another black memory fixing tamer which is alright, we already have Tai to do that, so now we have Izzy to do that as well. And on top of which, he has a really interesting when played ability where you get to check the top 3, and then if all of them are black, you get +1 memory, and then you get to basically return them into any order, so you're kind of like stacking the top 3 cards of your deck. So gaining the +1 memory when you do that could be pretty decent. It's unfortunate that it's not like a whenever you play a black Digimon or something a little bit more recursive, but it could still technically matter when the ability goes off, but it does limit the type of decks that he wants to go in. So this might not be exactly the best card to stick into like your WarGrowlmon deck, but regardless, it's definitely a really interesting ability to have nonetheless, and the ability to stack the top of your deck is also pretty interesting, considering we have a lot of cards that like to look at the top 3 or 5 cards of the deck. So knowing if you want to play that type of a card is definitely a really powerful thing to know, because you already have that knowledge on what's going to come next. And it definitely gives you more information to make more efficient plays rather than trying to play a card and then hope it hits. So I definitely think this Izzy isn't necessarily the worst Tamer card out there, but he's definitely not a good one. He's just really interesting, and I don't exactly know where he's going to fall, but he's just a pretty interesting card to think about. Next up, we have a new red Rise Greymon. So Rise Greymon is over here. He is a pretty interesting Digimon because he also digivolves off of red or yellow. So he could go into the current existing Shine Greymon deck on top of the new Shine Greymon. So that's just something pretty interesting to think about, because Shine Greymon hasn't really had like a super solid, good supporting Mega outside of just obviously playing Shine Greymon. So now you have more options to pick from and more options to utilize, and that's just something really, really good for the deck, and it's going to definitely push the deck forward. But on top of which, this card is an absolute monster of a card. So what this card is doing is not only does he digivolve off of red or yellow, which again, flexibility and versatility is very, very good, but this card has a ability where during your turn, this card's treated as a yellow Digimon. So kind of fitting more into that hybrid stuff that we saw earlier with Sylphimon and Shakuamon. So that's, again, something very, very interesting and very, very powerful. And then he has a main ability of digi-burst 2, where you get to choose a red or yellow Tamer card and play it without paying its cost. So he's doing something very, very similar to the other Rise Greymon. It's just you get to choose when you want to do this ability. So that means that you could digivolve this safely in the raising area and then move him out and then use his Digiburst ability before you digivolve up into Shine. So that's just something really powerful to think about. Like, again, it's just another Rise Greymon where it's just putting Tamers in for free, which, again, all supports what Shine Greymon wants to do, and we all know that Shine Greymon is very, very powerful. And then on top of all that, this card even has a pretty decent inheritable skill where he gives the when attacking ability. If you have a Tamer, you get to choose one of your opponent's Digimon and minus 2000 DP. So not only is he giving you a Tamer for free, essentially, but he's also setting up your Mega to start minusing the opponent's DP. And this is just a really solid ability to have because it just makes the opponent's Digimon weaker. So red, they could utilize a little bit more of their other removal options. And in yellow, they just can continue trying to stack all of the minuses to reduce the DP to 0 to trigger various abilities. So this card is just a very, very fantastic card overall, and this card is just going to be an absolute beast of a card to play. Next up, we have Lobomon here. So Lobomon is basically the blue Agunimon. All he really does is you could digivolve this off of a blue Tamer and treat that blue Tamer as though it was level 3. So again, just fitting more into that hybrid theme. I'm really curious to see what the rest of the hybrid Digimon are going to be doing, but this is pretty good because it's just a hybrid card to tie into what the hybrid strategy is doing, where they're trying to have a Tamer as their level 3 base, and definitely that has some interesting utilizations and definitely some interesting synergies. So I think this card is a pretty interesting card to think about and is definitely going to see a lot of experimentation. Next up, we have a WarGrowlmon. So technically this is orange WarGrowlmon, but I guess they don't necessarily like putting like the offshoot colors in the titles, but that's fine. I don't want to call this orange WarGrowlmon because it's still just a WarGrowlmon, but color variations aside, I think this WarGrowlmon is going to be a pretty interesting card because it has a nice main ability of digi-burst 2, where you get to choose one of your opponent's Digimon and minus 4000 DP from it. And then on top of which, it gives the inheritable skill, where during your turn, if you have 3 or less cards in your security, then this Digimon gets plus 1000 DP. So not only does he help start reducing the opponent's Digimon's DP, but he also can help buff your Digimon's DP, and the fact that this is in yellow is just doing everything yellow wants to do, so I think this card is definitely going to be a pretty good card to play. Next up, we have Orochimon. So Orochimon is a pretty interesting card considering he has a when evolving ability where you get to choose one of your Digimon, and it gains piercing until the end of the turn. So you could choose him to give piercing until the end of the turn. You could choose to give something like Sarismon piercing until the end of the turn. Like, there's just a whole bunch of cards that would benefit from having piercing, and the fact that we have a alternate way to give piercing is nice. It's unfortunate that he doesn't have an inheritable skill, but he's still a pretty interesting Digimon to play around with. I don't know how good he's going to be in the long run, considering green is already pretty stacked as a color, and I don't know if they exactly have room for this, but he's definitely an interesting option or a piece of utility to think about when you're building your own green decks. And then lastly, we have Babungamon. So Babungamon is a black level 4 Digimon, and he has the main ability of Digi-burst 2. And his Digi-burst ability is you get to choose one of your opponent's Digimon whose play cost is 7 or less, and de-digivolve it by 1. So de-digivolve is already a pretty interesting mechanic, and I don't necessarily think this is a bad card, but the fact that it is just a cost 7 or less card that it can only target is kind of unfortunate, and the fact that he doesn't give any inheritable abilities is also a little bit unfortunate, and it does limit what this card can do. But this is just a more early game card just to try to use some early Digiburst to try to limit what the opponent can do or try to mess up the opponent's plan. So it's definitely a really interesting card to think about. I don't know exactly how good this is going to be, but it's just spreading around the Digiburst mechanic, and that's kind of really what it feels like to me, but I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing, considering just more options and more utility to think about is always a good thing. So that's all we got over the past couple of days. It was definitely a lot of cards and a lot of new cards, and there's definitely a lot more excitement going into the set now that we know more about the set, and I'm definitely really looking forward to the set, not only for like my own personal biases aside, but mechanically I think that exploring around with Digiburst is really nice. I think that making yellow more of a viable color outside of Shine Greymon is definitely nice, and I definitely am really excited to see where the hybrid Digimon are going. So the set is definitely doing a lot of different things. I'm just personally waiting to see if they're going to expand on any of the current mechanics that we already have, like security Digimon. I'd really love to see more of those, on top of some of just supporting cards for some of the Digimon that we already have. So overall, I think these cards are all doing some really good things, and again, I'm just really looking forward to the set. So that's kind of all I have for this video. As always, feel free to tell me your thoughts down in the comments below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content, and I will see you in the next video.